Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw.
So just yesterday, my best friend sent me a picture of the two of us together. This was years ago, probably 15 years ago. And it just made me so happy because it was such a happy memory. And photography to me means preserving memories. I'm pretty ruthless about curating what photos I keep because if it's not something I'm going to want to look back at later, I don't care to keep it. But when you have photos that call up really vivid memories of things, they may not all be happy, but vivid memories of things that you want to remember. That's what photography means to me. Now, I'm not a great photographer. If I were a great photographer, photography might be a little bit more wrapped up in beauty, because I definitely buy the work of others and their photos are beautiful and can be appreciated, memory or not, because they're gorgeous pieces of art. My photos are not like that. So, yeah.
Perfect. Amazing. Celeste Headlee. I'm saying your name correct? Celeste Headlee?
Yep.
Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast, Shooting It Raw. And over the next hour, I'm going to essentially learn from you. We're going to the School of Celeste, and I'm in class. So I'm really curious to hear you out. Thank you for your patience. We had a bit of hiccups with scheduling. I'm 13 hours ahead, I believe.
It's 10 a.m. right now. I'm just outside DC.
Okay. So I'm in Hong Kong. So look, should we jump into your first image? I have no idea what it is, and I'm really looking. It's basically you're taking me on a kind of journey, and the listeners as well. This is great. So what I
don't know which one
is,
came to you first. Which one do you have as the first one?
It's the amygdala.
The amygdala.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the amygdala, obviously really important part of our brains. It is the oldest evolutionary part of your brain. It's like this little almond-shaped nugget right at the top of your spine, buried deep inside the brain, right? Because the way the brain evolves is that the very interior of it is the oldest part, and all the outer folds get newer and newer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's inside the cerebral hemisphere. It's an emotional part of your brain. That's not surprising. We are emotional and social thinkers. But the reason that this is really important to me is because the amygdala, there's so much left in the amygdala that is remnants of the species we used to be that is no longer helpful.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the amygdala tends to see everything through threat and fear.
Mm-hmm.
And it's constantly reacting as though it were under attack. That was probably super important when we were predated on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not important anymore. And you get these amygdala hijacks where you get this overwhelming emotional response. Now, it would be great if those were rare, but what has happened now is we have gotten to a space where we have started to view not other races as threats, and other religions as threats, but even other political parties as threats, meaning that we are having these amygdala reactions, these fear of assault and attack and fear freeze reactions to even an opposing political opinion.
Right.
And that's why I put it in here, because it's everywhere.
Okay. Good morning. Okay. So just for the listeners, because the podcast is ridiculous in the sense that we respond to images and theater of the mind. I kind of have to give some kind of anchor. Basically it's more of a diagram, or it's a diagram of a brain by itself. It's kind of like, imagine
looking from
a brain
the bottom up.
Yeah, that's been sliced, right?
Yeah.
And it's basically a graphic, and the brain is in gray and white and black, And then it's got these two, as you described, almond shapes that are highlighted in yellow. And beneath that are these kind of other smaller shapes in very bright green. And underneath that, there's a text which has the amygdala, two almond shaped areas hugging the center of the brain near the front, tends to become active when people dig in their heels about a political belief. Photo courtesy of USC Dorn Seif's Brain and Creativity Institute. Celeste, who are you and what are we doing? Like what? So as a person who has dealt with anxiety and I'm a human being living in the world today because of COVID, because of life, because of all that stuff. Of course, and somebody who's aware of this kind of research and fascinated by neuroscience and brain cognition, all that business, fight or flight. Why are we starting so strongly?
So, I mean, this has become such a focus of my work. I am a conversational expert, but
Mm.
over the period of all these years researching what works and what doesn't in conversation,
Mm-hmm.
I have to go back to the brain. I have to figure
Mm-hmm.
out,
Obviously, yeah.
at least in terms of social neuroscience, why we react the way we do, because we sometimes react in very illogical ways, things that feel illogical. But when you understand the connection of your neurology to your cognitive abilities, to your emotions, to your experiences and memories, to your physiology, when you begin to understand all those connections, things like, why do we avoid conversation if it's so good at us? Why do we hate talking about race, right? Why all
Mm-hmm.
these deeper questions that we have suddenly became a little bit more understandable. And yeah, it
Mm-hmm.
requires digging in a little to a little bit of science. But I will say that one of my gifts is explaining complicated science in more
Mm-hmm.
understandable ways. That's one of the things I do really well. So it's working out for me.
I love that you have the personal strength and self knowledge and confidence to make that sentence because good for you.
Thank you. I
Run with
appreciate. I
it. I
mean,
love it.
yeah. I mean, we could go into my weaknesses if you'd rather. I tend to be really truly aware of those as well, but that happens to be something I'm pretty good at. Yeah.
And I am such a fan because just this notion of if there's an us versus them situation, and it could be anything, right? Like us being baseball players or us being people who are left-handed or just a group of us in a room and then suddenly a them walks in. It could be a woman in a room full of guys or African American who walks into a room full of Caucasian people, and then the first thing that kicks in is the amygdala.
Yep. Exactly.
I'm talking to you like a muppet, so please, you're the expert, take it away from there.
The thing of it is that research shows us, and when we're talking about race particularly, we're who I'm usually talking to is a white person, because not only because they're the majority, they're the dominant culture, at least in the United States, but also three reasons here. Also because they have the most power to make change in
Mm-hmm.
discussions of race. They are the most likely to be believed. They're the most likely to actually be rewarded for bringing up these issues. But the other one is what we're talking about now, which is that white people tend to avoid these conversations. Even the very liberal minded, those who truly believe in equity and justice and are devoted to the idea that they want to bring about an anti-racist world. Even among those people, they have found that they will have a physical response. And in fact, people who have a lot of unconscious bias against African Americans, which is not just blatant racist, it's a lot of people who are quite liberal minded, when they are even have a brief exposure to seeing a black person's face, right? Even in a laboratory setting, in some cases, that all they did was show them a yearbook photo of a black person. The threat set off their body's alarm system. It produced this physiological response as though they were in combat or there was an oncoming car, right? They got restricted blood flow to the heart. There's a flooding of the muscles with glucose because the body's releasing cortisol. That's the stress hormone, right? Really useful if you're being chased by a tiger. Not so much if all you're doing is looking at a person of a black person. So you get this combination of the reduced blood flow, the amygdala jacks in, constrictions to your circulatory, your digestive system, a breakdown of muscle. That's what the cortisol is there for, because it's trying to get you ready to either flee or fight, or in some cases, freeze. It triggers the amygdala to perceive threat and arm itself for vigilance within 30 milliseconds of seeing that face. 30 milliseconds. Now, if you give your brain time to reframe what you've just seen, if you number one, admit that you're having that reaction, become aware of it and mindful, and say, uh-oh, my body's having a reaction to this. Let me think this through. This is not logical. And you allow time for the outer edges of your brain to kick in, the more evolved and the adults in the room, right? You can actually inhibit, you switch, you're kind of switching the amygdala off. You're putting it into inhibition mode. So this is like what I talk about all the time, is having this conversation even with yourself.
Okay, so we have the reflex, right?
Yes.
That kicks in. And but then you say, but you just need to kind of have the presence of mind to kind of give yourself a second to sort of step back or step down from that reflex. But wouldn't you say that we live in a world now where the majority of people who are, I would like to think, are pretty good?
And they think they are too. Most of us think we're good, yeah.
Wouldn't you say that for most people, most of the time, they're not taken hostage or hijacked by those 30 milliseconds, that actually most people kind of step that down? Or am I being naive?
I think you're being a little naive, because what we know is that, again, prejudicial assumptions, stereotypes that we make about people are automatic. 98% of our thought, neuroscientists say 98% of our thought is unconscious. And we don't know that it's happening. And what that means is that if you go through life saying, my conscious identity is liberal and open-minded and accepting, by not being realistic about the fact that you do have stereotypes and prejudices living in your subconscious, you are never going to be able to address them. You're not lifting up the rock and letting the creepy crawlies come out, right? You have to be honest with yourself about the things that live in your unconscious mind. That, the biggest problems we have with prejudice are a result of unconscious bias, not blatant racism. And and let me put it this way. Consider this for a moment. Less than 15% of American men are taller than 6 feet, but about 60% of CEOs are over 6 feet tall. And the last time Americans elected a president under 6 feet tall was 1896. But if you ask them, are you prejudiced? If you ask most Americans, do you have a prejudice in favor of tall people? They would say no. We give lower performance evaluations to people who carry extra weight. Doctors prescribe medical procedures based on patients' race. Teachers still to this day call on boys more than girls. These assumptions are not always about race. They're about all kinds of things. And they live in, And do I think that most people rethink it? No, because I don't think they admit that they're biased.
Here's something that's very disturbing to somebody who begins to put a toe in the pool that you swim in, is that if you read enough and get aware enough of what this is, you come to the kind of uncomfortable conclusion that free will kind of is an illusion that you kind of have to let go sometimes. This, you know what I mean? Like it's kind of painful to think that like free will and conscious and being and having a handle on our thinking, it's extremely slippery. It's this eel that's really hard to catch. I don't know. That's just how I feel. I mean,
I think it's a valid concern. I mean, this has been the big argument, right? Like there was this huge debate about this between Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky decades ago. How much of our behavior is guided by our genetics, right? By our biology.
Right,
Michel Foucault, not surprisingly, was like, none of it. We are completely free. And Noam Chomsky was like, oh, not so much. we have more control over our brains than neuroscience might suggest at first. But you have to dig a
Okay.
little deeper and realize that neuroscientists have also discovered how you can change your mind. That
Okay.
there's this a quality that they call neuroplasticity.
Hmm.
And essentially, okay, so let me explain this because to me it's super exciting. Obviously, I'm a
Okay.
dork about this
Yeah,
stuff
you
and I
can
get
barely
all
sit still. I
I
love
know I get all excited about it.
it.
So, I mean you can imagine a brain right now, this slimy gray with little curvy lines carved into it. Inside your brain are all of these neurons that connect with one another. So let's say, for example, that I do something super enjoyable and the part of my brain makes this connection because I have fun, right?
Hmm.
Now, if I play with my dog that way every day or maybe multiple times a day, I am then making that little roadway deeper
Yeah, yeah.
and more familiar, and it means it's going to be even easier for my mind to immediately jump to happiness and fun, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So we can actually, through repetition, through habit, we can literally carve new pathways into our brain.
Hmm.
And there's ways that you do this. There's ways to make them stronger,
Hmm.
associate them with positive emotions, right? For example, I tell people all the time, conversations are super good for you. They are.
Hmm.
They just are. As long as you're not arguing or hostile, that conversation is going to be good for you. So start associating with this positivity.
Hmm.
Associate conversations about race as little tiny nudges toward anti-racism, toward justice for the world, right? Another
Okay.
thing is to involve all of your senses, right? There's no lasting change in your brain that doesn't involve your nervous system. So visualize it, use your touch, use your movement. There's ways to make your brain more plastic. And that to me is super exciting and hopeful.
Which is what we're doing right now. And it's
Yeah.
obviously the enthusiasm that you have is really communicating. But we only have an hour and we have to move on to the next image. Isn't it crazy?
Yes.
We have to keep
It is.
rolling. You're so fun.
Let's just imagine this as an amuse bouche, right? Like if
Okay.
somebody is super into this stuff, this is
This is
an
great.
appetizer so they can go and do some reading.
I love the fact that you can't be like your energy is so infectious. I love it. I love it. Okay, so the next image I have is behind the which is bonkers. Okay, again, okay, so this is not a graphic. It's this beautiful image. Okay, so
It's a painting, yeah.
it's a painting. So it's underneath it. It says there's a title. It says "Behind the Myth of Benevolence," 2014, oil on canvas, and the painting is just really incredible. So it's like, okay, how to describe this? On the back side is a painting of a woman, maybe nude, seated at a bed. It's very almost like kind of like a Renaissancey, beautifully made rendition of African American women with a headscarf, sitting there, kind of looking at the viewer. But over her is draped a like a
Another canvas.
a canvas of a man, say of I don't know, say maybe 200 or 300 years ago in terms of the dress, older gentleman, probably
It's
white.
Thomas Jefferson.
It is Thomas Jefferson.
It
Okay,
is.
yeah. So speaking of biases, by the way, I'm not American, so this is like, oh, who are these people? Very interesting. Okay, so take it away. It's a very powerful image.
This was so Titus Kafar painted this. I think I think in maybe 2014, or at least that's
Hmm.
when it was exhibited. Um, and he tells the story that at one point someone described Thomas Jefferson to him as a benevolent slave owner. And he could not get this description, benevolent slave owner, out of his mind.
Hmm.
And so what you have here is the way he has it draped is as though there was a formal painting portrait of Thomas Jefferson and it came loose somehow. And
Okay.
and so it kind of fell off, and behind it you see this portrait of an African American, most likely enslaved woman, whose expression looks as though she's been startled from her work. Right? She looks
Mm-hmm.
like you've surprised her, and she's
Right.
looking up, and it's so powerful to me.
Mm-hmm.
And now in the United States, most people know the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was the African American enslaved woman, light skinned, actually about the same skin color and amount of black heritage as I have, that he raped for many, many, many
Mm-hmm.
years, has many children with her. And of course, he chose not to even free his slaves at his
Mm-hmm.
death, as opposed to George Washington.
Ah.
So Thomas Jefferson is a particularly sore spot for African Americans, because this is a guy, if you read his writings, he knew how wrong slavery was. He
Mm-hmm.
knew it. He
Mm-hmm.
knew it was immoral. He knew that African Americans were human beings,
Mm-hmm.
um, and he continued to do it anyway. So this idea that such a thing can exist, that one can be a benevolent slave owner, is exactly as ludicrous as to think that Thomas Jefferson had a consensual relationship with Sally Hemings. Of course he didn't.
Mm-hmm.
That's not consensual. She's even enslaved her. That is rape.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
this portrait, it means so much to me, and it hits me every time I look at it, because he without saying a word of shame, just absolutely, through just the beauty of this image, he's getting to the heart of what we're really talking about here, like
Mm-hmm.
getting to the meat of the conversation, at least in the United States. There's been slavery in many other nations, but here it was our peculiar institution, and it was never ever benevolent.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, to put it mildly.
Yeah, to put it mildly. And yet that person said to Titus, Thomas Jefferson was a benevolent slave owner, right? Like, most of us would say, well, of course. And yet someone said to a black man that Thomas Jefferson was a benevolent slave owner. That to me is just, it blows the mind.
Let's bring it back to the amygdala, shall we?
Hmm.
So, how do you take it beyond that front first level, okay, which
Hmm.
is the sort of the first interpretation, and go go deeper into that? Because why don't you kind of share? Because right now, what I really hear is your passion and the emotion and the feeling, but how do we translate that into a more educational moment, or sort of like learning moment or something, for so that somebody really kind of understands beyond just the kind of the lesson of abhorring slavery, even though, for example, there is modern day slavery. But how do we make a bridge for people to listen and to sort of kind of go beyond, like, deeper?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll try to answer it, and then you can.
This is how I interview. I kind of respond, and then the person says, "I think you're asking this. Maybe you run with it."
So this painting is about digging down to the truth.
Okay.
This painting is about being honest about history.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. Look, you're in Hong Kong, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think about all the things in Hong Kong's history that we really need to be honest about and tell the truth about before we
Okay.
can begin to amend anything, before we can move forward. We have to tell the truth about things that have happened in our history. And
Okay.
that's, I find that's true. Anybody, I think, can relate to that. And frankly, that's not even just about nations. That's in your own family. I mean, think of all the secrets that we keep in our own families, and how it it prevents us from having truly honest, authentic relationships with people, when there's this unspoken history going on, when one person is allowed to believe things happened a certain way and everyone else knows it did not. That's as true in a romantic relationship as it is in a family, as it is in a nation. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what this painting is about: is take pulling down that superficial cover,
Mm-hmm.
and revealing and exposing the truth underneath, even if it is, in this case, it's not, she's not ugly, but the truth of what's happening to her is. And it
Mm-hmm.
means having the courage to pull off that covering,
Mm-hmm.
and look at our history and ourselves with
Mm-hmm.
realism and honestly and authenticity.
Yeah, I hear you. And so, how do you? What is your relationship to time and history then? Like, how do you interpret or understand your own place in time?
I mean, again, I'm not sure I understand the question, but I will try to answer the thing I think you asked.
Sure.
Um, my, I am I am Jewish and African American, and so when
Hmm.
I think about my own history and my ancestry, there's a lot of ugliness in my past.
Hmm.
My great grandmother was the first of our family on that side born free, and yet that means that my great great grandfather was a slave owner.
Mm.
My great great grandmother
Okay.
was an enslaved person, but I have to also grapple with the fact that you know she was attacked repeatedly by her slave owner, just the way Sally
Hmm.
Hemings was with Thomas Jefferson. That's tough. I'm writing a book about my great grandmother right now, and I go through genealogy, for example, and my family's history cuts off before the
Hmm.
Civil War. I can't track it.
Mm.
My family was not considered important enough. In fact, I go back a couple steps before 1865, and all it says is slave for
Hmm.
a female slave. That's it. No
Hmm.
name,
Hmm.
no birth dates. Those records weren't kept. So, my place in history, I feel a weight of history on my shoulders. And that's not just for
Mm.
the Black side of my family, the Jewish side of my family also, because Jews, when you're raised in among Jews, they constantly say, never forget, never forget, never forget. The message being, if we forget what happened in World War II, we may repeat, it may happen again. We have to
Mm.
always remember that this is what human beings are capable of.
Sure.
Something that I never took seriously as a child. And now, as an adult, with all the things happening in the political world, I realize how true that was.
Hmm.
And so when I say that I feel the weight of history, I mean, I feel the weight of the very, very hard earned wisdom of my ancestors on my
Hmm.
shoulders. And so I can't, I'm not just inventing a life and a legacy for myself. I have to honor and respect and carry forward their wisdom and experience as well.
That's a lot. That's a lot to
It
carry in one head and on one pair of shoulders. So you said you're writing. Is it? Have you written many books, or you're writing? This is your first book.
no, I have, it depends on how you count. I have three mass market books I've written, and then I have two ebooks, and then a shorter book that I wrote for broadcast professionals on interviewing and stuff. So a lot, many
Okay.
books. So this would be like my fourth mass market
Right.
book, but the first one that's really personal. I write
Yeah.
nonfiction.
Okay.
So, and it is a lot to carry, but it's also a gift.
Mm-hmm.
So my grandfather is very famous,
Mm-hmm.
one of the most famous composers America has produced.
Oh,
And
okay.
I remember a lot of people trying to commiserate with me, saying how tough that must be to be raised in a family with somebody who's that famous and is like a capital G genius, right? And I just don't see it that way at all. For me, it's been liberating. My whole life, I see this as not just a gift, like he was amazing, because he was amazing, but also it's been personally liberating, right? I
Mm.
don't. There's no pressure on me to be a genius. We have that covered. Like there's no.
Yeah, got it.
I'm not going to be the most accomplished person in my family, and that's freeing. I don't have anything to prove. So
Wow, no, just because the podcast has been around for 3 years ish, coming on, and because of my interest goes where I invite the people onto the podcast who I'm like, oh, I wonder what this person's about, and I'm as a kind of a learning experience for myself, because sometimes I get these like happy accidents where my guests I'll be like, oh, so you've written some books. She goes, oh yeah, how many have you written? And I come from the world of writing, and she's like, oh,
mhm.
400 and something. 400 and something. So the premise of the podcast is we're allotted a finite bucket of seconds, and how do we make every second count? And it's fascinating to me that we've never met, and what's coming out of your head. is very portentous, like not pretentious, but portentous, like very big, very kind
Oh,
of like it's this kind of this weight of history and responsibility and your own responsibility to your own legacy and history and family and all this stuff. It's fascinating and it's inspiring. You seem very buoyant and you don't seem weighed down by that.
thank you. Yeah, I'm not weighed bound down by it.
Think of it as a question or not. Maybe it's not a question. So how do you respond to what I just said?
I mean, I see that as lucky.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I'm really lucky. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
number one, I'm super lucky. My grandfather wrote really, really beautiful music,
Mm-hmm.
and he was a good person.
Right.
Right? He is someone that I can truly be proud of.
I see your last name Headley, and I don't recognize who your grandfather would be.
So his daughter was my mom, so her married
Mm.
name is Headley.
Okay.
My grandfather's name William Grant Still. He's the dean of African American composers.
Okay.
And there's so much to be proud of
Mm-hmm.
in all that he did. There's like, frankly, we have so many accomplished people in our family
Mm-hmm.
that I'm super jazzed about being related to them.
Yeah, that's
I mean, I
awesome.
don't.
Awesome.
Yeah, I love
Mm-hmm.
my family. I mean, I have some stinkers like everybody else does. Everyone has some people that are not, pleasant or whatever it may be. Um,
Wow, you're part of a human family.
yeah, exactly, exactly correct. And for the most part, I really lucked out. And I think the other thing is that my life has been like so many people's. Life has been tough. Life is hard.
Mm.
You do not make it to age 50 without having been through some things.
No, of course. Yeah, of course. Of course.
Yeah, and I think that it makes me happier because it reduces the fear. Like, what are you going to do? I've been through it. It's happened. The
Mm.
worst happened.
Mm.
It happened already in like my 20s and 30s. you
Mm-hmm.
know Whatever it is, I'll either get through it or I won't, and that's the way that goes. Like,
That's the way
yeah.
it goes. So on that happy note, should we go on to the next photo?
Yes, which one is next for you?
Aw,
Oh,
Celeste,
it
this is
must be my
great.
dog. I'm guessing it's my dog.
Yeah, so I think his name is Seamus.
Her name is
Uh,
Samus. If you're a
Samus.
video
Sorry,
game
sorry.
player, she's named after Samus Aran, originally in Metroid.
Ah,
Yes, yes.
okay. So the photo is. It's hard to know because the angle's a little bit skew. So first of all, somebody's holding on to the dog kindly.
That's me.
What kind
Yeah.
of okay? You're holding on to. So what kind of dog is this?
She's a mix. She's mostly a Walker Coonhound.
Nice, nice.
Mhm.
On below her feet is it says it's like a
My doormat. Yeah.
yeah. Hope you like dogs. You're just outside your house. It's probably summer in DC, maybe. There's a
Yeah.
plant. There's just a little plant. Could be a fig tree. You're wearing this nice blue dress. The dog, like Samus, is looking up at the photographer with a nice sort of view, but almost saying like, "What? Why? What?" Okay, so take it away.
So this has so many things that I love in it. Mostly my dog, who is just the
Mm,
sweetest in the whole world. She is
mm.
7 years old. We rescued her from a shelter in Macon, Georgia, and she was going to
Oh,
be put. She was going to be put down that day.
ah,
Like, she
well.
already, yeah. And yeah, it says, hope you like dogs, because then don't come in. If you don't like
Mm-hmm,
dogs, it's
mm-hmm,
not
mm-hmm.
probably the not right
How many
house for
dogs do
you.
you have in your house?
I only have one, but when we bought this house, the dog across the street, who's named Chaco,
Mm-hmm.
she and Samus bonded immediately, and they are a
Nice.
bonded pair now. They are best friends. So I often have two.
Okay.
The plant that you see is my pepper plant. I mean, I live on the
Oh,
East
nice,
Coast of,
nice.
of the US, but I grew up in Los Angeles. So in my
Mm-hmm.
cooking, I use a lot of different kind of peppers, and they don't
Mm.
always have them in the store here. So I have to grow
What kind of
them.
pepper is it?
I think that's a poblano
Mm-hmm.
pepper. It may be an ancho. Anyhow, I always have a whole bunch of pepper plants every summer.
If you could see around me, I have 5 dogs in the house, and I have 4
Yeah.
cats. So
Yeah. So you get it.
I get it.
Yeah, she's my heart.
How do we convey the tragedy of a dog,
The tragedy of a
of a
dog.
dog's life?
Oh, you mean because it's short?
Yeah, that's a hard lesson. So, for example, my daughter's 11, and she's already lived through the death of about four of our animals, and they're all companion animals, they're all beloved pets. And so, my personal dog, who is like probably like your Samus, is Kafka. And Kafka's 17 right now, 16, 17, which is very old for a dog. So, how do we wrap up what you had started with amygdala, then with a painting, and then now this image of Samus? What's the connection?
So I'm going to tell you the story that this veterinarian shared on social media some years back. Because this vet had a family come in, including this little 6-year-old boy, and they had to put their family dog down. And the
Mm-hmm.
6-year-old said, and I'm paraphrasing here. The 6-year-old said something like, "Well, but when we're born into this world to learn how to love other people and live and be good, right? But dogs already know how to do that, so they don't have to stay as long as we do. They're just here to show us how to do it." And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's such an incredible core of truth to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, compared to other animals, we live a very short life. We do live a very short life. How do we grapple with the tragedy of our very short life?
Mm-hmm.
You live, you know, earlier you referred to making the most of every moment. That's what you do. And think about how well a dog does that. I mean, think how easy it is to make a dog just filled with joy. It
Mm-hmm.
is so rare to see a human adult filled with joy. It
Mm.
almost never happens. And yet for dogs, it happens all the time. Dogs who are well cared for. So in terms of making the most of every day, you know, they live shorter because they really live life to its fullest extent. When they are
Mm.
eating, they are loving that food. When they are getting scritched, they are in that moment
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
loving having their belly scritched. They are absolutely present and
Sure.
ready to, they don't care if they look stupid. They don't give any thought whatsoever to whether they smell or not. They are just
Mm-hmm.
in the moment.
So riddle me this. How does a dog's relationship to history compare to ours then?
So, you know, the more scientists are able to study this, the more we are able to extend our reliance on dogs further and further back in our history. You know, at one
Mm-hmm.
point, Homo sapiens was not the only human species, right? I
Of
mean,
course, of course.
there were several different human species, and it's been a mystery for a very long time how Homo sapiens survived, because
Mm-hmm.
Neanderthal was better. They were more resilient, they were stronger, bigger brains.
Did you hear the one hypothesis that I think is quite appealing is the idea that Neanderthals were just kind of assimilated really out of through time,
Yeah, because we have Neanderthal
through
DNA.
good old fashioned fucking. We got
Yes, but really, it was Homo sapiens that came out on top. I mean, the vast majority of our DNA is Homo sapiens.
yeah, for sure, for sure.
Um, so, and there were several other human species that did not make it. But Homo sapiens is really fragile.
Okay.
We are quite fragile. We're not particularly fast.
Mm.
A change of temperature of maybe 10 degrees can make us uncomfortable. We don't have a thick hide.
Nope.
We don't have tough claws. We can run a long distance for a long time, but we can't
Mm-hmm.
run faster than most creatures. Cats can outrun us, right?
Yeah, but we listen. Give credit where credit is due. I mean, like humans can really run far. Like we can.
We can. Can run for a long distance. Elephants can go further. And frankly, it doesn't matter how far you can run if the wolf is going to catch up to you in the first 100 feet.
Okay.
Right?
Sure. Sure.
So let me bring this back to dogs.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons why we survived, the main reason why we survived, is because Homo sapiens put a lot of our evolutionary energy into becoming the most advanced communicators and collaborators on the planet, which meant you were
Mm-hmm.
never just
Mm-hmm.
messing with one human being. You were always messing with more, right? There's
Yep.
always a way for us to figure out who has what skills and talents and coordinate them in the way when we can do things we could not possibly do, like take down a bison,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Of course, of
But the
course.
other thing is that we have empathy and we're able to establish empathic bonds. And so we
Mm-hmm.
found these canines who are also extremely sensitive to emotional landscapes,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it was a match made in heaven, right? We
Mm-hmm.
found each other's talents and skills and we began to immediately form empathic bonds. We have the same response to seeing a puppy almost as we do to seeing a human baby.
Yep. Yep.
And very, very early on, we established these strong emotional bonds with our dogs, and they helped us.
What about this idea of, let's wrap it back. Let's tie it back to the amygdala one, right? Fight or flight. The first reaction of being faced with, let's say, an opportunistic carnivorous predator within our midst, but slowly but surely became part of our group,
Right?
right? In the sense of like, here we have this dog that at first we're kind of suspicious of and leery of, and then but slowly but surely assimilated and became part of our pack.
Yes.
So, using your brain in terms of what you know, how would you connect the importance of that connection, say with Samus, in your life, in your daily life, in terms of the deeper needs that, is it she or he?
She.
She
Samus
fulfills.
Aran, the
Yeah.
character Samus Aran is a girl, which is another very interesting story, but I won't go into it. So dogs are so have evolved along with us, and they have
Mm-hmm.
evolved in ways to meet our needs
Mm-hmm.
so efficiently that if I'm having a tough day and I come home and start scritching my dog, yeah, that's making my dog feel good, but it's also lowering my cortisol level and
Yep.
lowering my heart rate and lowering my stress. We
Mm-hmm.
have evolved together through a communication that did never required language. So it is ironic that here we are, Homo sapiens. We evolved in a way that risked our own deaths in order to have language and speech. By which I
Mm-hmm.
mean that in order to
Right on
yeah,
cue.
yeah, sorry about that. In order to articulate
That's
well,
great.
our larynx had to move further down our throat, which is the reason why we sometimes choke. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so this language that has been just crucial and a survival skill for us, and yet our greatest friend has no shared language with us. But they do have a shared language. They have an emotional and social language that we share.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
The
yeah.
semiotician in me would say that we share a lot by way of language in terms of the meaning that we ascribe to a dog's look. Like in this photograph where she's looking, I mean, it's funny because this image is very meaningful for you because you chose it and you curated it. And the expression is like, it's really funny because within the photo, the, it's like her like what is she telegraphing to the photographer? You mean like if that is a symbol, if she is actually using a kind of visual language, or you're projecting that in terms of why you chose this image, what is she communicating?
So for me, she has a slight smile in her face. Samus is, like I said, mostly Walker Coonhound, but
Okay.
she has a little bit of Pibble in her. And Pibbles are famous for their smiles. They're those dogs with the big, broad smiles. And
Ah,
she
okay.
has just enough in her that she
Mm-hmm.
smiles. When I look at this is this is my dog smiling. Like she is content. And this is like, welcome to my house.
Mm-hmm.
Like
I hope
she
you like
abs
dogs.
Yep, hope you like dogs because this is my house. Like she knows she is part of a crucial part of this family. She knows her
Yeah,
place in this family. She is secure in it.
for sure.
And she is that this is the welcome you would get at my house. Like she is like happy. She knows she's loved here. Yeah.
And I really appreciate that this is what you're putting into the world. You mean like you're telling to the world, hey everyone, like if you want to learn how my brain functions, you have to accept that the guardian to the gateway, to the doorway to come in, is this being who is going to, you kind of have to go through her first.
Probably try to
Okay.
lick you.
Probably. Well, with that sentence
Yes.
in my ears, I'm going to go on to the next photo. It's crazy how fast these conversations go. Whoa, hard left.
Yes, this is a hard left. Speaking of front doors.
Okay, so in a totally different emotive step, the last photo is a photograph of what's probably a cafe or something. It's just a close up shot of this sign that's kind of this nicely aged, kind of a little bit stylized. Just a sign in a like a door, like a shop or something. It says, "Sorry, we're closed." It's a color photograph. In the reflection of the glass of the door, you can just make out what is probably a summery scene, I guess. Could be Brooklyn in the background. I have no idea. Sorry, we're closed.
But you can see that it's still light out, right? It's not
Yep.
nighttime.
Okay, what's going on? Celeste.
So, some of the best advice I gave myself was to come up with a time of to come up with my shop's hours.
Okay.
Like, when does the
Ah,
Celeste store, open and close? When do
interesting.
I flip that sign over to closed and I
Interesting.
am done with business and done with work? And for me to think of it that way, to preserve and protect my private time, my time when I live as opposed
Mm,
to work, is easier for me to do when I think of it as a physical object, as me flipping that sign over, because that is not negotiable,
right.
right? The sign's over, we're closed.
Yeah, you're setting really firm boundaries.
Yeah, it's like, it's not an issue of morality. It's just like, hey, you missed, come back tomorrow.
Hmm.
This isn't like I don't like you, that's why I'm not ignoring your email or your phone call or whatever it may be. It's like, you came too late. We're closed.
Mm. Okay.
um, See you
What's
tomorrow.
going on? What's going on, Celeste? That this is such an important lesson that you're putting out into the world.
So the second book that I wrote was
Hmm.
called Do Nothing. And it was not the book I was intending to write second.
Oh, interesting.
But what happened was I got so busy and overwhelmed in my life. I was just going all the time. I was traveling for work like 4 or 5 times a month.
Hmm.
And I broke. I mean,
Right.
I just broke. I couldn't sustain it. I
Mm.
was irritable with my son, who's my favorite person in the world.
Hmm.
I never had time to walk my dog. It was a different dog at that point, but she started gaining weight, and I wrote that book because I was trying to find solutions for myself.
Right.
And over the course of the research for that, I ended up writing a book, yeah, but I also started clearly defining and articulating my own boundaries. And it's
Right.
especially true in jobs like mine, and I assume in yours, where you are engaged in social contact all the time and you are making emotional connections with so many people. You can very quickly get burnt out by that. It's fulfilling and it's wonderful, but it's also incredibly taxing.
Hmm.
And so for me especially, and I'm sure for a lot of other people who have similar experiences, it's very important to create those boundaries and to protect them with respect, without rancor or anger,
Hmm.
but just with respect. We're closed.
So why don't you give somebody like, since we're at the school of Celeste, how do you, so for example, have you heard of the book The Power, no, The Courage to Be Disliked?
Yes.
Okay, so how would you communicate this important lesson of treating yourself like a shop that has operating hours?
So the reason that it became a full length book is because it's so deeply ingrained, and this is not just Americans. It's deeply ingrained in many cultures around the world, including a number of Asian cultures. This believing that identity is work,
Mm.
that who you are is what you do, that is what gives you value,
Hmm.
and that's wrongheaded. Your work is just what you do to get your food, shelter, and water. And then you go and do all the things that make you you.
So in terms of I know it's not very scientific necessarily, but in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of need, the idea that you kind of need to satisfy the food, shelter, and clothing sides, of your survival before you can start looking into these other, not to say they're not important, but these, other areas. So as a person, as myself, as a person who I'm greatly affected by my status as a working person, so that when I'm not working, it definitely does shake me pretty intensely. And it totally raises the fight or flight reflex, right? Like when I'm not earning a living, I'm definitely in survival mode. And so, don't you need to have a certain don't you need to have operating hours, or kind of like, don't you need to have a shop that is functioning to actually be able to say, okay, hey, I have work hours, the shop's closed.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there'd be no point in having an open and close sign for a shop that nobody was
Hmm.
going to,
Okay,
that
okay,
wasn't
sure.
making any money, obviously. But the first thing I'll say is that the hierarchy of needs has been updated and needs updating. It's There's a real question about whether humans actually behave in a hierarchy format, and part of that is because that original idea of that pyramid that Maslow created doesn't account for the fact that our needs change based on our situation.
Sure.
So Celeste, at the period of her life when she was living paycheck to paycheck, had a very different set of needs than Celeste now, who has the absolute privilege of being able to close that shop door earlier than ever. And I don't work on Wednesdays. Wednesday is not a work day for me. So
Mm.
that would not have been possible for Celeste in her 30s and even into her 40s.
Hmm.
Our needs change all the time.
Sure.
But the fact of the matter is that for all human beings, all of us, there is an innate nature. Like there
Hmm.
is such a thing as human nature. Michel Foucault was wrong about that.
Okay.
There are things that are common to all human beings. And obviously, the first one is that we need food, shelter, and water.
Mm.
That's just survival. And what you're talking about, getting a job, that's what a job is intended to do. That's the way our society is set up, is to earn you food, shelter, and water. After that's satisfied, the number one need that a Homo sapiens has is for belonging.
Hmm. Okay.
Number one.
Okay.
And your job doesn't help you with belonging. Whenever a boss says to you, we're a family, that's crap. You're not a family. Families can't fire you
Mm.
without warning
Mm.
at the drop of a hat. Families don't negotiate whether they're going to give you health care or not. That your job is not your family.
Sure.
So I would say, I know we're wrapping up here, but I would say, this is a great place to end, because it's about finding your own priorities, establishing your own boundaries, your own limits, not based on your amygdala thinking, not
Hmm.
based on what you perceive as a fear or a threat, not based on dishonest histories, but like
Hmm.
really being honest with ourselves, knowing who we are and what it is we actually need at that moment. That's sort of, for me, that has been the key.
And dogs.
And dogs. You need
Oh,
dogs.
Celeste, you wrapped it up so beautifully. I mean, like, it couldn't have been more. You've done this before. I loved it. That was beautiful.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Thank you so much. Wow, this has been, I think, in terms of the feeling, it's like how no podcast conversation ever felt like it's been dragging ever. But this one, it's like, it's just poof,
Over fast. Yeah.
amazing.
Oh, good. I'm glad, because we were talking about complicated stuff.
I know. And in its own way, it's kind of like, it was like a dog's life. It was too short. It was beautiful.
I'm so glad. I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Shooting it raw?